a podcast about amazing people from an incredible state. Amazing Arizonans with Mike Broomhead.
Back with another edition of Amazing Arizonans, and someone I've known for a long time. And if you don't know who this guy is, you're going to learn a lot today about Arizona. It's Gordon James from Gordon C. James Public Relations. It's so good to have you do this.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
It's every time you and I talk, first of all, the conversation lasts a lot longer than probably either one of us intended it to. But I learned so much and new stories from you. You have been involved in American political world, in that world, since Bush 41 was vice president to Reagan. Is that right?
Actually, I started with 41 in 1978. I was his first landlord in Des Moines, Iowa. I got a call from my former commanding officer in the Iowa Army National Guard, and he said, I got this guy running for president, and he needs office space in Des Moines for the Caucasus. And I said, I got just the space. 5th and Grand, Insurance Exchange Building, ground floor, retail space. He'll love it. I said, who is it? He says, George Bush. And I went, who's that?
That's so weird.
And when the president came to open the office, I fell in love immediately. He was just such an interesting guy, and that was the end of me.
And so was it your intent? Has it always been your intention to go in the direction you did, or did you happen to go down this path in your career?
I had no idea. When I went to Central High School here in Phoenix, and my mom loaded a bunch of us up in a car in 1964 and had us go down to the Barry Goldwater headquarters and stuff envelopes. That was the only time I'd even been involved in anything. I had no clue what was going on. I didn't know if I was a Republican or a Democrat. I just knew that George Bush was a great guy.
And I think a lot of us form our political opinions that way as well. As our first foray into politics, whoever it is that happens to be the person we admire, we kind of end up going down that path, don't you think?
I think so. I never got involved with policy discussions with him. We just had work to do and images to create and a job to do, and we just did it. And we did it out of loyalty to him.
So the reputation he had before his death, during his life, was that he was just a good man. Is that accurate?
He saved my life. I was when I went to work for him full time in 1986, I was at a low ebb, and he took me under his wing and no questions asked, and that created a bond that I will never forget. And I miss him so much. I can't tell you. Just being able to talk to him and share stories But he was extraordinarily loyal. And to those that helped him get where he got, even more loyal. To his family, to his friends, to his staff, to his security, to everyone. He just was a great friend. And I mean, I don't know, you could have done just about anything, and he'd have forgiven you, I think. So.
When you look back at those days, were you surprised, even then, what would be considered mild now, but at the time it got vitriolic? The Ross Perot thing when he didn't win re-election. Since you were so close to him, did you take it more personally? Oh,
it was a disaster. I will tell you, I was so naive that on Election Day in 1992, we were in Houston, and we went for a run in the park. The president and 50 of us, we all went for a jog on Election Day. And I jogged up next to him, and I said, Mr. President, it's going to be a great day. And he went, are you kidding me? We're going to come in third. I went, we are? I had no idea. And he knew. And the next morning, that night, it was awful. He was backstage and in tears, and I don't know how he pulled it together to go out and congratulate President-elect Clinton, but he did. He pulled it together and got backstage. And the next morning, we were sitting in the staff office at the Houstonian, and he came jogging by, and he had a big Afghan wrapped around his neck, and his face was all drawn, and he was just exhausted, and went for a short run around the track at the Houstonian, and we were all just down in the dumps. And about an hour later, Mrs. Bush came into the office, and she said, get over it.
Really?
That was the tone.
She was another. I mean, I don't know how many of these stories we can tell in this segment, but she really was larger than life.
She was a terrific friend and so loyal to him and to her whole family. And she loved Lisa James, my wife.
Yeah.
Everybody
loves your wife.
Yeah, but I'll just tell you one story. Mrs. Bush came to Phoenix, and Lisa was staffing her, and Mrs. Bush invited her into the back of the limousine. And they got in the car, and Mrs. Bush said, "You want to see my toe? I had to have my toe amputated."
Ooh.
And Lisa went, "No, I really don't want to." And she pulled off, she used to wear these Keds, one blue and one red, and she pulled off her shoe and showed her toe amputated. Lisa was just like, oh. But they were great friends, and we used to call her Big B and call her the enforcer. And she was the loyalty enforcer,
That family, Jeb Bush being the governor of my home state of Florida, but then going to work for W. 2000 was a weird primary. There was that animosity between him and McCain. But 2004, I thought I would never see, and that was my first jump into anything. I couldn't believe the vitriol in that campaign. How much had it changed from 41 to 43 and the vitriol on the campaign trail?
Oh, I don't think ever.
Really?
I mean, when people complain about politics and the way people talk about each other, I go back to 1861 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. I mean, half the country left, and then they killed him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been worse. Vitriol is a tough word. It is. All politics is local, and all politics is very personal. And you got to be able to take it. You got to be able to take the heat. And President Bush could take it. And he and President Clinton, 41, and President Clinton got to be very good friends later on. Mm-hmm. And
they did a lot of great charity work together.
We went to the tsunami area. We went to the Maldives with them, the two of them. They played cards. They were just great friends. And he called him Bubba.
But it's such a weird alliance. The political rancor, and I think I've seen this happen almost with every president. While they're in office, they take a lot of criticism and a lot of heat from the opposition. They're under the spotlight. But history dictates how the world and the country perceives them. Reagan was called a cowboy. He was going to World War III, shouldn't be near the nuclear codes. And then Gorbachev was at his funeral. Is that pretty much how life goes?
Oh, I don't know. We are America, and we have the ability to speak out and speak our minds, unlike Russia. Think what's going on today in Russia. You can't do. So we take advantage of it. I think it's a blessing, and our system is not perfect, but it certainly has worked for a long time. I appreciate it. I've been all over the world, and when people ask me where I like to be the most, it's at my home here in Phoenix.
So let's tell some of those stories. Right before we turn the cameras on, I've known you I've known you since 2004, and you dropped a bomb on me that you met Vladimir Putin. Can you tell a little bit of that story?
So there is an annual event in Indonesia. It's a Asian Pacific Conference, I think something like that. And in 2002, I think it was, President Putin was invited to attend. And it's Japanese, Korean, Philippine, Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese were hosting it. And they had built a beautiful new convention center in downtown Saigon. They built it to host this, but it was to be used later on for other things. And we arrived. President Bush arrived there for the first gathering of all the leaders.
Is this 41 or 43?
43.
Okay.
And President Bush, George W. Bush, in 2002, and they had met before. President Putin and President Bush had met before, and the two were walking toward each other. And he goes, and President Bush says, "Poot, hey Poot," he called him Poot. But I got to meet him also at that particular place. And then the President Bush's lodging was on an island in Saigon, the same lake that President McCain or Senator McCain had crashed into. There was an island there with a hotel on it, and he was staying at that hotel. And they had a bilateral meeting at that hotel, and President Putin came to that too, and I got to meet him then. He's a very interesting guy, and I think that in the early days of 43's administration, they had some respect for each other, but that slowly slipped away. And at the end, President Bush was very suspicious of him. In the beginning, it was pretty good, but as time went on, he didn't trust him anymore.
The perception in the world is that he would love to see the U.S. fall, because wasn't he with the KGB when the Soviet Union fell? So here's a patriotic guy for his nation that he saw fall. Reagan caused this with the Cold War ending. He's always been perceived as a guy that would love to be able to turn the tables on the U.S. Do you still believe that's true?
I don't think necessarily he wants the United States to fail, but he wants Russia to succeed and be the world power. That's his goal. And as it turns out, he thought he could take Ukraine in a week, and it's not true.
Yeah.
So he's not as tough a guy as he maybe thought he was.
Yeah, it's with all the things that walking through your office looks like almost like a history lesson, and walking through the pictures in your office. Something that was very personal to me is Iraq and what happened in Iraq. Can you talk about that time? Because what is going to be written in history books, what will be in history books for our children to learn from, you were a part of the handing over the government to the Iraqi people and all of those significant occurrences. You were a big part of making all of those things happen. Can you just talk a little bit about those?
I wasn't on the policy side, but my job was to create an image of an independent Iraq, a democratic Iraq. And we spent about 5 months working with Ambassador Bremer, who was the head of the coalition provisional authority. We spent about 5 months with him, and then we spent 1 month with President Alawi, who was going to be the new president of Iraq, and helping him get organized and helping the turnover of the government. It was a very exciting time. I patterned a lot of the stuff we did over, just like we do in the United States. They'd never had an elected official. They'd never had an inaugural. They'd never had nothing. They didn't have cabinets. They didn't, nothing. And it was just starting from scratch. And they had to write a constitution. They had to create a document of some kind, to govern their country from scratch. And it was an extraordinarily interesting time. The Iraqi people are wonderful people. And the climate in Baghdad is identical to Phoenix. It's dry, hot, citrus, dates, just like Phoenix. The temperatures were the same. But I think that the novelty of a new government and stuff was ripe for things to go wrong. I mean, what can go wrong? Well, lots can go wrong,
yeah.
And things did go wrong. And the after 2000, this was in 2004, July 1st, 2004, when we turned the government back over to them, things went south, and they had to have lots of things changed. It'll be 20 years next year.
Yeah,
20 years, and I think things are much better, much better. I think that the graph and the money disappearing and whatnot, I think those things are disappearing. And I don't know. For years afterwards, when I left there, the suicide bombers and all the trauma and the tribal issues and the Sunnis and the Shiites back and forth, and it was just one thing after another. And 3,000 of our troops were killed.
And then ISIS, the uprising of ISIS.
ISIS, the whole thing. That all seems to be quieting down. Things seem to be fairly normal. Investments seem to be picked up. I would love to go back. You know that the new embassy in Baghdad is the biggest U.S. embassy in the world.
I have a friend who works there as a private contractor at the embassy doing security, and he says it's huge.
It's a bill-paying center, for one thing, but it's also part of the CIA and everything else that's working out of there. And I just saw they just had laid it out. They hadn't even started construction when I was there. We were working out of the palace, but it was an interesting time. It was really an honor to be a part of something like that, and to think back. I mean, I literally would go now. In 1792, when George Washington, that's how I was thinking, because that was what was happening right there.
And so let's talk about the capture, the trial, and the execution of Saddam Hussein. Can you walk me through because you were so close to for Americans, we saw it maybe one way with very little insight. What was your insight into what happened there?
Well, of course, he ran and was hiding out. His sons were killed. One son committed suicide, and they killed their children, and then the other was killed. He was held at Abu Ghraib's under very tight security because they weren't sure what he would do to himself or what anybody else would do to him. He would appear in court. I never actually laid eyes on him. I came very close a couple of times, but they would move him. It was all very tight security and very secretive because he was just a main target.
I have a friend who was a part of that detail that guarded him.
I got to meet the colonel that interrogated him right after they got him out of the spider hole. It was just fascinating, her stories about him and what she was saying. He was defiant right up to the end. I will tell you that because someone videotaped with their phone his hanging, it was disturbing.
Yeah.
It affected me that this is the end, that what happened. I understand. It was the Iraqis convicted him in court, and they did it.
Yeah.
It wasn't us. It wasn't the coalition. It wasn't the Brits. It wasn't anybody. It was the Iraqis did it. But it was disturbing to see him end that way. I was glad not to have to hear his voice anymore.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Yeah.
But
when you look back at that time, though, did it seem like justice? Did that seem that did he?
Oh, for sure. When Secretary Powell was trying to convince the United Nations of the weapons of mass destruction, and of course it turned out and they couldn't find anything. But there were three people that were the weapons of mass destruction: him, Saddam Hussein, and his two sons.
Right.
They were horrible, and just to have them off the face of the earth was a good thing. Justice had been served.
So I know that we are not going in order, but I want to go back to 9/11. There were a friend of mine who's lost his brother who was a firefighter on 9/11, and his best friend was working in the towers. So he lost his best friend and his brother on the same day. I've heard him speak in public many times, and I think he quotes Giuliani in saying it was the worst of humanity met by the best of humanity, if you look at how we responded to that. But the connection you had to the fear in America and being that close to the president, what can you tell us about that time in the Bush administration?
I had a very interesting experience. We were actually on 9/11, 2001, we were actually here in Phoenix, in bed, when the first plane hit. And we got a call from a friend of Lisa's, and she said, "Turn on your TV, there's something terrible happening." And one of my sons was working for MTV at the time. And as the time went on, and we didn't know, when it was going to end. I mean, the fourth plane crashed, and the Pentagon was hit, and the two towers. Nobody knew that this was the beginning or the end or what was going to happen. And we started trying to find my son. And, of course, the cell phones were jammed. You couldn't get through. And believe it or not, I was ready to get in my car and start driving to New York because I was desperate to find him. About 4 o'clock that afternoon, Phoenix time, we got a call on the landline, and he had walked all the way back to his apartment on the Hudson River, across the bridge, and made it back.
Where
safely.
Was he?
He was just 3 blocks from
ground
the
zero.
MTV's offices were just down the road,
blocks.
down the street.
Wow.
And of course, we were elated. And about a month later, there's an annual event called United Nations General Assembly in New York, where the president comes and gives his annual address there. And so I was asked to do that trip. And I got to New York, and the first thing, of course, we did was we went down to the site. And at the time, it was still a crime scene, and you couldn't take pictures or anything. But there was a big wall, a big plywood wall that had been set up, and all the leaders that came were signing the wall. And every time they would find a new body, they would sound a horn, mm-hmm. and everything would stop, and then they would take the body out. And then when the president went down there, it was just a very moving experience. And I wasn't there when he did the bullhorn. That was that day. It was about a month later when I was with him. But the patriotism of our country and the flags flying from over front doors around the country, and the support that everyone was showing for each other and for their neighbors and for their families was just unbelievable. It was a different time.
That bullhorn speech, what seemed to be an off-the-cuff remark in response to someone yelling out to the president, "We can't hear you," and his response saying, "Well, I can hear you, and the people that brought down these buildings will hear from all of us soon." That roar from those firefighters, and all rescue workers, I don't know if they were all just firefighters, but that seemed to be, in that moment, an American cry. I mean, it was obviously just very spontaneous. But that kind of echoed, I think, the feeling of Americans. And we were just so afraid. And then out of the fear came anger, right?
Oh, totally. I mean, it was terrifying. We were under attack.
Yeah.
Who knew how far this was going to go? Was somebody going to hit downtown Phoenix or?
Well, remember they were stopping trains and the subways, and then even back then, because buses were still Greyhound and Trailways were still big companies, and they were pulling buses over. There were reports that there might be things on buses. We just had no idea what was going to happen next. And I think for the first time, Americans felt like we weren't secure in the lower 48 in the continental United States.
During World War II, there were attacks by the Japanese in Alaska, mm-hmm. and I believe in Washington State there was somebody lobbed something in, and then there were Germans that got in on the East Coast and stuff. But it really was just very minor. Well, this was horrific.
Yeah,
and how it could happen,
mm-hmm.
and I think. I think President Bush felt his only job, the only job of the President of the United States is to secure the United States. That's really and truly. And I think he felt like he'd let us down somehow.
Did he ever talk to you about it? I mean, did you have conversations with him about it?
Not directly, but I've been in when he describes the day. I've been in multiple times when he's given the address where he's described the day. It's an unbelievable story. You'll be on the edge of your chair listening to him. And
you invited me to a couple of events, and I've heard him tell this story. Let's talk about the pitch at Yankee Stadium when he first pitched of the World Series. That again was another moment of Americanism that you could not, if it was in a movie, you couldn't make it up any better. That was an amazing moment.
It was unbelievable, and I had never seen him do this, but I saw his dad do it when he was getting ready to go to wherever it was to throw out the first pitch at any game. He would practice with an apple on Air Force One and throw it down the aisle. And you understand, he had on a full flak jacket underneath his shirt. This is kind of awkward.
Yeah.
It's kind of limiting. And he threw a perfect strike.
He did.
It was just perfect. And I think if I know the story correctly, that some of the players and some of the guys said,
Derek Jeter,
don't hit it, don't bounce one in there. And he threw a perfect strike.
Yeah.
And so it was great. It was a great moment.
When you look at your time with him, and with both of the presidents, when you were with them. there was a significant amount of history that was being made. I know I keep saying we're going out of order. I want to go back to Bush 41, to George H.W. Bush. The war on drugs, that we had seen this cocaine explosion in the 80s. But it was really Bush 41 who said, we've got to get involved in Colombia in some way. We've got to do something about this. What was that time like when he said we have to? America saw us get involved in this war.
He was as naive as you and I are. He had no idea how to stop this. We were hosted by the Colombian government in Barranquilla, Colombia, for a drug summit of 3 of the South American countries. Colombia hosted us. I lived on the USS Nassau for 3 weeks because it was too dangerous to go into Barranquilla to work and stay overnight. And so we would helicopter in each day to do our work and get ready for the summit. So the summit happens. So President Bush is having private meetings with the leaders. And he says, what do we have to do to get you to stop growing opium? Just stop growing poppy. He said, and with a straight face, the president of Colombia looked at him and says, you stop buying it, we'll stop growing it. Mm-hmm. We are the biggest consumers of narcotics in the world. It's just, we're in an epidemic now.
With the fentanyl.
With the fentanyl. It's just unbelievable. 100,000 people a year are dying from fentanyl overdoses. A border wall is not going to help. They're going to get it in here somehow. We are just consumers. Mm-hmm. President Bush was as naive as anybody. We had a drug czar, Secretary Martinez, who my oldest daughter, worked for when he was made drug czar, where she met her future husband, and they thought that was unusual that they were dating in the same office, so she moved over to the White House and worked in the personnel office at the White House. There were all sorts of messages, and Mrs. Reagan, of course, had her,
just say no.
Just say no thing. I don't know what to do, Michael, about it. It's just beyond belief what people will think of to take and buy and consume, even though they know it's going to kill them.
Is there a way, because I've compared on the air, because I was in South Florida at the time of growing up in the 80s. I grew up in Florida in the 80s. So I saw what used to be bales of marijuana in the Gulf of Mexico. They used to call it square grouper that was thrown over the side of the boats. I watched the DEA shift from chasing bales of marijuana to kilos of cocaine, and the violence escalate because the money escalated so much. I've compared that to what we're seeing in Mexico with fentanyl and the growth of the cartels. The difference is now we've got these powerful cartels on our continent. They're at our southern border.
Both sides.
How do we face that? I mean, obviously we're not going to go into Mexico, but what can we do? Because the cartels are as much a threat to us as the drugs that they're sending here.
I've been down to the border in the last 4 years several times, and if I had an answer to your question, everybody asks the same thing. Well, what do we do? Mm-hmm. They arrest people. And then somebody comes and takes their place, and they're on both sides of the border.
Absolutely.
So it's a business. I have no. I would, if I said this is what we should do. Everybody has said this is what we should do, mm-hmm. and it's not worked. We just have to somehow convince Americans not to buy these drugs. We have to stop the business. And I have no idea how to do that.
Yeah, it's a tough proposition. I want to go back to the personalities. We talked a little bit about President George H.W. Bush, but W, thanks to you, I've had a few interactions with him. And there's some of the stories we probably can't tell. But he is a very funny, unassuming person. He has the persona of the president. He really, he commands the respect of the president. But at the same time, I felt as comfortable talking to him as I feel talking to you right now. He's just that kind of a guy.
He can turn it off and on President Bush Sr., 41, once he became president, he got a little more reserved. Although I did spend some time in his living room in Houston after he left office, and he had a Barco lounger that wouldn't fit in the den, and his head would be out in the hallway, and we'd be sitting there watching TV, and the facade left, the presidential facade wasn't there, and he was just like sitting with your best friend, and but 43 could turn it off and on. I just tell you one small thing.
Okay.
He could pass gas on demand.
I was wondering if you were going to tell that story.
So
your wife cringes every time you tell that story. I've heard you tell it to people before.
He's a card, and we kind of grew up together. We're the same age, and when back in the 80s, we were great friends, and if you'd have told me then that he was going to be president of the United States, much less governor of Texas, I'd have said that's not going to happen. But he had a transformation, 27 years ago or so. He stopped drinking, and I think Laura had something to do with that, and his dad and mom had something to do with that, and he just kind of went through a transformation. He's an extremely bright guy, and Yale graduate, and very intelligent. And now with his art and all the things that he's doing, who'd have thunk that?
He's interesting because he was very compassionate to me the first time I met him. And I don't know if you remember the story or not, but your wife had given me an email address for Jeb Bush, a direct email address. And it was a ridiculously simple address to figure out in hindsight, but it was his email address. I thought I was emailing someone that worked for Jeb Bush. My brother had been killed on Memorial Day of 2003. That November for Veterans Day, he was being inducted into the War Memorial in my small little hometown, Fort Myers. And it's the classic old courthouse, banyan tree, big rock memorial, just everything you would think in a small town. So we invited the governor, and I invited him via email to come, and he couldn't come. He was obligated to do something else, which we understood. But I had said in the letter, in the email, just brother to brother, you must be as proud of your brother as I am of mine. And well, I didn't realize it, but he forwarded my email on to President Bush. And then in the middle of October, I received a handwritten letter on presidential cardstock, front and back, a handwritten letter from the president. When I got to meet him the first time, I reminded him of the letter and the email. He remembered it, and it wasn't just that he said he remembered. He remembered the letter, mentioned some things about it, asked me how my mother was, and he began to cry. He began to tear up talking about my brother, made me cry. And I'll never forget that short interaction with 1,000 people around that wanted, it was a campaign event, that wanted autographs. He stopped long enough to make me feel like I was the only guy standing there. And every time I had an interaction with him, he made me feel exactly the same way.
That's a wonderful story, Michael.
Isn't he? But he's that kind of a person.
Yep, they both were.
Yeah.
The whole family is.
Yeah.
All the kids and grandkids and soon great-grandkids. They're all great. And it's I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. Live with them in Kennebunkport, and they're just like anybody else. They have their ups and downs, but they're loyal to each other and loyal to their friends.
Give me another story or a time where, because you have done so many things, where you've been in a situation. You told us about Iraq, which is, I can't even believe the history of what you were a part of there. That you were in a situation where you thought, I cannot believe I am in this situation right now.
Almost every day. I mean, here's a Central High School kid, lived in 3rd Street in Glendale. What am I doing here? Literally.
Yeah.
And I was fine almost on all these adventures until the day before the actual trip. And then I'd start to panic that night. It was just unbelievable to be a part of this whole thing. I'm trying to think of any one particular incident.
You're going to be hard-pressed to top the Putin story. I mean,
that was so interesting, and to be with Gorbachev even before Putin.
Okay, let's go there.
Well, I mean, President Bush Sr. and President Gorbachev were great friends, and when President Reagan asked President Gorbachev to tear down this wall, it happened after President Reagan left office and President Bush was president, and President Bush could have made a big deal out of this, could have made a huge deal out of this, that this was pressure put on Russia by the United States, but he didn't do it. He didn't shame Gorbachev or anything. He was very composed about it, was happy about it, and gave a congratulatory note to everyone. That was about it. And he could have done a lot more. In the times that we were with Gorbachev, at some summit in England or someplace, or wherever we were, they were great friends and they got along terrifically. And he could have taken the credit. President Bush Sr. could have taken credit for the wall coming down, but he didn't do it. He was very modest about it, and he gave Gorbachev and Reagan the full credit for getting it done.
Did you have a lot of interaction with Reagan?
Very little, but I'll tell you, the times that I did, I couldn't believe it because I didn't really think his cheeks were red. I thought that was makeup or something.
Right.
They really were red.
What was he like?
I didn't really get to be with him that much. The only times that we were together was when President Bush and Vice President Bush and President Reagan were together, which was not that often.
Right.
You'd think it would be, but it wasn't that often. And I really didn't, have any real visits with him or anything. He seemed from my vantage point to be a really genuine, caring person. I don't think Mrs. Bush and Mrs. Reagan got along too well.
Really?
I don't think so. That's hard to tell. President Bush and President Reagan had lunch once a week together in the Oval Office dining room, and that was a good policy. And I thought that was gracious of President Reagan to do that and keep him informed. And President Bush 43 and Vice President Cheney had the same kind of relationship. I don't think President Trump and Vice President Pence had that relationship.
I don't.
Something tells me.
Now, I told you that I was going to keep you away from
okay, thank you.
controversial topics, but you're the one that brought it up. You started this. No, I agree with you. So then let me just ask a question in that direction. I look at diplomacy around the world. I don't think, after the loss my family has suffered, I don't think we should be the world's police force. I'm not that kind of a person. But I do believe we have to be invested and involved around the world. If you look at in Afghanistan how the Chinese and the Russians have moved in and how mineral rich that country is, and in Syria and other places in the world where they're making investments and they're diplomatically involved, do you think diplomacy has changed since the days when you were in the White House with 41 and 43 to where we are now, just in general?
It's hard to tell. Because I was so close to it and fly on the wall at so many of these meetings and saw the relationship that the presidents had with the foreign leaders. They seemed to honestly be, with Margaret Thatcher and Trudeau and all these. They seem to be really friends and to be in sync with each other. It's hard for me to tell how President Biden's doing, and I never was on a foreign trip with President Trump, so I really don't know how he got along with them. I will tell you, just to go back a little bit with Iraq, the first people that moved in there to take economic advantage were the Chinese. They were there the second Saddam Hussein was gone. They were in there, drilling with oil and whatnot. They weren't bashful at all. So, but it's hard for me to tell today the relationship. I will tell you that President Biden seems to have been able to put a pretty good coalition of people together on the Ukrainian issue. It's not just the U.S. that's providing arms. It's Germany. It's England. It's everyone. And the same thing happened in 2001, and 2003, in the coalition in Iraq. It was, multinational coalition. And President Biden seems to have, he's not heading it up by any means, but he's a part of it.
Right.
And without the United States, the coalition to help the Ukrainians probably wouldn't be succeeding.
When you look back at your time doing what you did for the presidents, and yours was about image, correct? I mean, yours was about, would people be surprised at either the similarities or the difference between the perception of a situation and what was really going on?
Smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think, I lived by, this shows you how old I am, a photo above the fold in the New York Times. What's above the fold and what's the New York Times?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you get it online, and but that was how I lived, or the Arizona Republic or the Los Angeles Times, and the front page articles and the photos and the news stories, which were not at. Right then, it was not until 5:30 or 6 o'clock, that you would see what happened on a national basis. But I think that what you saw was pretty accurate. We would try to create, if we were doing a handicapped American Disabilities event, my job was to create a visual that showed how this new law was helping people that were handicapped. Mm-hmm. And I would take full advantage of the situation. I mean, I would find people that were in wheelchairs or whatnot, and this was helping them, or blind, or whatever their handicap was. I was guilty of that, but it was real, and they were honored to be there.
Yeah, you weren't making up a scenario; you were amplifying
it and trying to help. My job was to tell a story with a picture. Mm-hmm. And once the president got out there, he was on his own.
Yeah.
I didn't know what he was going to say, but it was a big relief to see him step out onto the stage.
All right, I'm going to go back to a story that I have to have you tell if you're willing in a minute, but I want to ask you, because I don't know the answer to this. Were you at Reagan's funeral?
No.
You weren't, because I was going to ask about the interaction, just because you were talking about, we talked earlier about legacy. The fact that Mikhail Gorbachev sat next to Margaret Thatcher at Ronald Reagan's funeral tells a story about the Cold War and then ultimately the respect that they all ended up having for each other. Don't you think?
I think so. I'll tell you a Margaret Thatcher story.
Okay.
So we were in London, and it was some kind of bilateral meetings with Mrs. Thatcher and President Bush Sr., and we had to walk between buildings for some reason. And Mrs. Thatcher was not as... of course, couldn't walk as fast as President Bush, and he just left her for some reason. He just was walking ahead, and I was back with Mrs. Thatcher. And she looked at President Bush, and she looked at me and said, "You really love him, don't you?" I said, "Well, I do." And she saw the respect that President Bush had. Yeah. But I did not go to the Reagan funeral. Of course, I was at Mrs. Bush's funeral and President Bush's funeral. But
you've got to tell me the story of a failure of yours, the Queen.
I'm never going to live this down.
This is, when you tell this story, it makes me laugh. I've only heard it twice. This will be the third time. I love this story.
So I was working at the White House, and so events on the South Lawn came under our office's job to help create this. And there was some problem on the portico, on the south portico, and so we had to move our staging and stuff for the state visit of the Queen of England to the White House. We had to move it down by the fountain. So we had a big to-do, and of course the Queen was coming. It was a state visit, and as we had all the pomp and circumstances and the old guard and the whole thing, and hundreds of people, and as you know, as I've told you, Michael, the president's podiums are built for their height, and President Bush was 6'2", so his podium was quite high. But there's a little tray you can pull out for people our height to stand on, and so you can see the person, and so they can speak into the microphone. So normally the president speaks last. So when I would get ready for the event to start, I'd pull the tray out for the person that was introducing the president to stand on to talk. Well, in this case, the president spoke first, and the Queen was second. So he's welcomes the Queen to the United States. She walks up and disappears. All you can see is her purple hat and her white gloves. And I'm about maybe 15 feet from the podium. And I'm going, and I can see the cameras are just going nuts, and I can just back, and you can hear the cameras just, something's wrong. And I'm looking over at the Bushes, and Mrs. Bush is going, he's giving me the look. And Ambassador Werner Reed was my boss. He was the head of protocol, and he was just, oh, this is a disaster. I could have crawled up onto the stage and pulled out the tray, but it's the Queen of England, for goodness sakes. I wasn't going to tap her on the knee and say, excuse me. So we just let it go. So the next day, she does a joint address to Congress, and she says, I hope you can see more than my hat today. Oh. And I went to Ambassador Reed, and I said, I'm so sorry. He says, don't say anything. I'll talk to the president. Don't worry. So he apologized. So I think this is, we're out of everybody's forgiving everybody. Ambassador Reed passes away. His obituary in the New York Times, what was your worst day at the White House? Is the day the Queen disappeared behind the podium. It's totally my fault. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. I think that's going to be on my headstone. So,
well, it's just because you've been so sick. We hear all of these great stories of all the things that you've done. It is kind of fun to hear something that didn't go right. Yeah, that didn't go right.
Of course, when the Queen passed away, okay, what's in the United States? Yeah. What's the picture you see? It's all over the place with her.
So you get a whole new life to your story. I love your story. I want everybody to be able to read your book. Talk about your book for a moment, because you wrote a book, and tell us what it's about, and tell us.
It's a family book, and I'm happy I've given you a copy.
Yep, I have a copy of it,
and I'm happy to share it with anybody that wants one. It's not you can't buy it on Amazon or anything, but it's just for the 41 to 43, and it's just about how it happened.
Yeah.
And how I was so lucky and so blessed to get to do this work. I mean, believe me, when I was at Central High School and Richard C. Simon School, if you'd have told me someday I was going to be working at the White House, I'd have gone, is that the house down the street? I didn't even know for sure where the White House was.
Do you ever have any friends from high school that ask you how?
Oh, yeah. I'm still friends with a lot of people here. And when I came home 30 years ago, when we lost the election in '92, Lisa and I thought we'd stay in D.C., but we didn't realize that everybody was going to leave. All our friends left. And so we came home, and so glad we did. And I reconnected with a lot of my friends from high school and grammar school, and still keep in touch with them. And I don't think they're that impressed, to be honest with you. I think they just kind of went, well, it's kind of interesting, but big deal. They've had successful lives, too.
My friends are shocked at anything that's happened to me, because I was such an idiot when I was so young. I was, do you remember the place here in town, Mr. Lucky's?
Of course.
So I used to announce the bull riding and ride out there at Mr. Lucky's. So fast forward, that was in 1995, 96, to 2000. 2004, the final presidential debate is at
Gamage.
Is at Gamage, and then the post-debate rally is at what is now Chase Field, but it was Bank One Ballpark. Your wife calls me and says, our MC fell through. Can you MC for the president today? And I said, sure. So I ran home, put on the only suit I owned, got into my work truck with wire hanging off the sides and ladders, and drove down to Bank One Ballpark. And I had a Secret Service escort, because I guess they didn't trust me to be by myself. But I was walking past the first base dugout. Now, there's 30,000 people. It was packed. I'm walking past the first base dugout during kind of an intermission, and I hear somebody scream my name out from, just a few rows up in the stands. And it was a couple of the bartenders and waitresses from Mr. Lucky's looking at me. What in the world is this? And I said to them, I have no idea. I have no idea how I got here. But, in all honesty, you and your wife have been so instrumental. If it had not been for your wife, I would not be sitting where I am right now. And certainly without your help along the way, I wouldn't have had the success I've had. You guys have been instrumental because,
thank you, Michael.
well, you were able to, you gave me opportunities. I mean, your wife just said, hey, you need to do this. And I did it. And the next thing you know, I'm all over the country. It was an amazing ride, and it was because of the two of you. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're very kind, and you deserve everything you've gotten.
Well,
and
I don't know about all of it. But thanks for the time today. I love the stories. The reason why we're doing these podcasts is because there are so many people here in Arizona that just have amazing stories. And I don't know that there's anyone that has more amazing stories than you do.
Some of the stories that I tell are actually true.
Well, the other thing I like that you do before we close this is on your Instagram account, you'll post pictures of stuff and say, I stole this from the White House, don't tell anyone. And it's ornaments or pens and how much of that is true that you took it?
I was the only one that had to go through the magnetometers on the way out of the White House. I had more stuff. And I said, what do you got there? Very important.
So do you have a piece of memorabilia that you treasure? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of them, but is there one that you especially treasure?
The best one was there in my office, and when you walk in, on the left is a big portrait of President Bush in his flight jacket.
Yeah.
And that was hanging in the Presidential Inaugural Committee in 1989, and I really wanted it. It was just a poster. It wasn't framed. It was just a big poster. David Valdez took that picture, and I really wanted it. So about a day before the actual inaugural, I took it off the wall, and I was going out the door with it, and the security guard says, where are you going with that? And I said, oh, the president wants this at the White House. I'm going to take it to the White House. And I took it right to my apartment, and it's traveled with me ever since.
And it's great. I've seen it in your office. It's huge. That's a big picture. Huge. That's bigger than a movie poster. That's a big poster.
It's my favorite. So,
well, thanks for the time. I appreciate it. It is so good to have him. Gordon James, thank you.